The Theory of Political Economy by William Stanley Jevons. Chapter 7 Theory of Capital. Part 2 Capital is concerned with time. Several economists have clearly perceived that the time elapsing between the beginning and end of work is the difficulty which capital assists us to surmount. Thus James Mill has said, if the man who subsists on animals cannot make sure of his prey in less than a day, he cannot have less than a whole day's subsistence in advance. If hunting excursions are undertaken which occupy a week or a month, subsistence for several days may be required. It is evident, when men come to live upon those productions which their labor raises from the soil, and which can be brought to maturity only once in the year, that subsistence for a whole year must be laid up in advance. Much more recently Professor Hearn has said, in his admirable work entitled Plutology, the first and most obvious mode in which capital directly operates as an auxiliary of industry is to render possible the performance of work which requires for its completion some considerable time. In the simplest agricultural operations there is the seed time and the harvest. A vineyard is unproductive for at least 3 years before it is thoroughly fit for use. In gold mining there is often a long delay, sometimes even of 5 or 6 years, before the gold is reached. Such mines could not be worked by poor men unless the storekeepers gave the miners credit, or, in other words, supplied capital for the adventure. But in addition to this great result capital also implies other consequences which are hardly less momentous. One of these is the steadiness and continuity that labor thus acquires. A man when aided by capital can afford to remain at his work until it is finished, and is not compelled to leave it incomplete while he searches for the necessary means of subsistence. If there were no accumulated fund upon which the laborer could rely, no man could remain for a single day exclusively engaged in any other occupation than those which relate to the supply of his primary wants. Besides these wants he should also, from time to time, search for the materials on which he was to work. These passages imply, as it seems to me, a clear insight into the nature and purposes of capital, except that the writers have not with sufficient boldness followed out the consequences of their notion. If we take a comprehensive view of the subject, it will be seen that not only the chief but the sole purpose of capital is as above described. Capital simply allows us to expend labor in advance. Thus to raise corn we need to turn over the surface of the soil. If we proceed straight to the work, and use the implements with which nature has furnished us, our fingers, we should spend an enormous amount of painful labor with very little result. It is far better, therefore, to spend the first part of our labor in making a spade, or other implement to assist the rest of our labor. This spade represents so much labor which has been invested and so far spent, but if it lasts 3 years, its cost may be considered as repaid gradually during those 3 years. This labor, like that of digging, has for its object the raising of corn, and the only essential difference is that it has to precede the production of corn by a longer interval. The average interval of time for which labor will remain invested if the spade is half of the 3 years. Similarly, if we possess a larger capital and expend it in making a plough, which will last for 20 years, we invest at the beginning a great deal of our labor which is only gradually repaid during those 20 years, and which is therefore, on the average, invested for about 10 years. It is true that in modern industry we should seldom or never find the same man making the spade or plough and afterwards using the implement. The division of labor enables me, with much advantage, to expend a portion of my capital in purchasing the implement from someone who devotes his attention to the manufacture, and probably expends capital previously in facilitating the work. But this does not alter the principles of the matter. What capital I give for the spade merely replaces what the manufacturer had already invested, in the expectation that the spade would be needed. Exactly the same considerations may be applied to much more complicated applications of capital. The ultimate object of all industry engaged with cotton is the production of cotton goods, but the complete process of producing those goods is divided into many parts, and it is necessary to begin the spending of labor a long time before any goods can be finished. In the first place, labor will be required to till the land which is to bear the cotton plants, and probably 2 years at least will elapse between the time when the ground is first broken and the time when the cotton reaches the mills. A cotton mill, again, must be a very strong and durable structure, and must contain machinery of a very costly character, which can only repay its owner by a long course of use. We might spin and weave cotton goods, as in former times, or as it is done in Kashmir, with a very small use of capital, but then the labor required would be enormously greater in proportion to the produce. It is far more economical in the end to spend a vast amount of labor and capital in building a substantial mill and filling it with the best machinery, which will then go on working with unimpaired efficiency for 30 years or more. This means that, in addition to the labor spent in superintending the machines at the moment when goods are produced, a great quantity of labor has been spent from 1 to 30 years in advance, or, on the average, 15 years in advance. This expenditure is repaid by an annuity of profit extending over those 30 years. The interval elapsing between the first exertion of labor and the enjoyment of the result is further increased by any time during which the raw material may lie in warehouses before reaching the machines, and by the time employed in distributing the goods to retail dealers, and through them to the consumers. It may even happen that the consumers find it desirable to keep a certain stock on hand, so that the time when the real object of the goods is fulfilled becomes still further deferred. During this time also capital seems to me to be invested, and only as actual utilization takes place is expenditure repaid by corresponding utility enjoyed. I would say, then, in the most general manner, that whatever improvements in the supply of commodities lengthen the average interval between the moment when labor is exerted and the ultimate result or purpose accomplished, such improvements depend upon the use of capital, and I would add that this is the sole use of capital. Whenever we overlook the irrelevant complications introduced by the division of labor and the frequency of exchange, all employments of capital resolve themselves into the fact of time elapsing between the beginning and the end of industry.